This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at Machon here in Jerusalem. He's the author of numerous books, including the two-volume Palestine in Turmoil, The Struggle for Sovereignty 1933 to 1939, which was recently published in English by Academic Studies Press. It explores the rise of two increasingly adversarial national movements in British-ruled Palestine, the Jewish one and the Palestinian one. Professor Monty Noam Penkower, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
So why 1933 to 1939? What was so special about this period? How decisive was it?
It was decisive in the history of Palestine for one basic reason. Prior to Hitler's advent in January of 1933 in Germany, the conflict between Arab and Jew was really focused on a religious plane. The riots of 1920, 21, 29. However, in 1933 we see a shift, hence the subtitle to this book, which is The Struggle for Sovereignty in Political Terms. It takes a decidedly nationalist political turn, and I think in these critical 6.5 years until the outbreak of World War II, we witness this increasingly.
Sovereignty on the part of whom? The Palestinians, the Jews, or both?
As an example, when does this really begin? Most studies focus on the outbreak of the Arab Revolt in April 1936, which actually, despite tremendous British efforts and also Haganah efforts, the Jewish defense arm of the Jewish Agency, that revolt went on for 3 years. It reached its peak in 1938 and then petered out. It brought in the Arab nations. The Foreign Office wanted them to get involved in resolving this issue.
The British Foreign
The
Office.
British, that's right. It was, after all, under British mandate. But it's a struggle not only on the Palestinian Arab side for sovereignty, also the Palestine Jewish or Yishuv community, which until now, I think most of its leadership, there were exceptions, the revisionists under Jabotinsky, believed that somehow a modus vivendi could be arrived at between Arab and Jew on socialist lines. Ben-Gurion, as an example, held that illusion, as did a number of other people, until the Arab Revolt. But most studies err in thinking that somehow the Arab Revolt broke out like mushrooms after a rain in a forest. It doesn't happen. There have to be roots. Mm-hmm. The roots are Hitler's advent in 1933.
Because it made the prospect of many Jews coming to Palestine a lot more palpable?
That's partly, but also because through the Jewish Agency, with the approval of the German government, a system known as Havara, many Jews were able to transfer capital, and in the form of agricultural and industrial implements, which changed the face of Palestine. Mm-hmm. Now, if you are a Palestinian Arab, and you will see legal immigration of over 60,000 in its peak, 1935, and earlier. So you're dealing with suddenly another 150, 160,000 Jews, you'd worry.
Yeah.
You'd be more than worried. You'd pick up your fist and say no more. And why then the political side? I say the switch to political, the struggle for sovereignty. It begins actually in November 1935. What happened then? A very charismatic sheikh by the name of Izz al-Din al-Qassam was murdered by the British, actually through an Arab informer, which is an interesting story. And all of the Arabs who could make it went to his funeral near Haifa. Ben-Gurion writes in his diary, now the Arabs have their Trumpeldor. Just as Yosef Trumpeldor became a legend after the murder in Tel Hai in 1920, Ben-Gurion said, here is a person who is joining religious jihad, a holy war, with an effort for a nationalist control of the country. And the minute this happened, a week later, the 5 out of the 6 Arab political parties, united for the first time, went to the High Commissioner, Arthur Walkup, and said, enough to Jewish immigration. We want an independent Palestine, and the Arabs were a majority.
Yep.
They were, by the 39, a little over 1 million. The Jews were about 400,000. So that's where the political break begins.
But don't you think that the Palestinians knew or feared that it was going this way from the onset of the British mandate and the support that it gave to Zionism?
No, because you do not have the formation of political parties that are strong with pressure from youth groups from below to really galvanize. That Arab revolt not only shocked the British, it shocked the Haganah, and it shocked the Arab leadership. They wanted gradually to move. They were going to go to London and negotiate, etc. And this revolt is from below, and this is what Ben-Gurion referred to. Here are Arabs ready to give their lives for national sovereignty. But the Yishuv also, as a result, gradually built up an infrastructure, not only the Haganah, the military arm, the Histadrut, the labor organization, and all sorts of things, exports, etc. It turned both communities into a ongoing struggle between them for sovereignty.
But if they saw sovereignty as this achievable goal or desired goal,
Right.
why did they reject the partition plan 10 years later? I mean, it would make perfect sense that, that would give them sovereignty, right?
Who rejects?
The Palestinians.
Actually, well, Palestinian, for a correction, at the time referred to Jew and Arab. The British in their documents, whenever they say Palestinian, they mean Jew and Arab.
Okay.
So to answer your question, rejection of partition on the Arab side is clear. They want it all. They're a majority. That's number one. And the Jews are foreigners, aliens coming into the country, etc.
So they just wanted the Jews out of the country.
Correct.
That was
This was very clear. And it's even hinted at in warnings by the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and Audi Belhadi, who was one of the major leaders of the other parties there, in which they said to the Peel Commission, which proposed partition, when asked, what about the Jews who are now living in Palestine, not even to talk about the future? History will decide, they said.
Okay.
That's a veiled hint. We want to get them out, you see. We have to remember that the Jews were also aware that it wasn't just the Palestinians in Palestine, their leadership increasingly radicalized, as I said, pushed by the youth to really call a halt to Jewish immigration, etc. The Arab nations supported this. In fact, in 1939, February, when the British, in a last attempt to arrive at some modus vivendi, called Jews and Arabs to a conference in St. James Palace, the Arabs refused to sit at the same table as the Jews. Now, the Jews did not totally reject the partition offer. A small majority supported it. Many were opposed. Why were they opposed? From the right to the left. The left, because we want a binational state. That was the illusion of Hashomer HaTzair, Judah Magnus and company, etc. On the other hand, there were many people of the Haganah, Shaul Avigur, Elio Golem, who said it's not military viable. We need something much larger. And then there were those, of course, of the extreme Orthodox camp, Agudas Yisrael. We don't want anything that goes counter to Torah positions. And revisionists, of course, objected. They wanted both sides of the Jordan River.
Yeah.
But a small majority at the Zionist Congress supported it. The British retreated when the Arabs rejected it, and then on ultimately to abandoning the partition plan.
Right. But if we talk about sovereignty within the Zionist leadership, you said that before 1933 there was some kind of illusion that there might be another arrangement.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on that?
I certainly can. There's no one monolithic Zionist leadership. Jabotinsky and company were the only ones early in 1923, Jabotinsky's famous essay, The Iron Wall, who said, the Arabs are a very respectable nation. They know the Bible. They know the Balfour Declaration. What they also know is power. What we have to do is create a large Jewish army, both sides of the Jordan, then the Arabs will sit down and negotiate. That was one position. Ben-Gurion and others who came from a socialist-leaning Russia, most of the leadership of the Jewish state in the making, Medina Baderech, came from Russia. Ben-Gurion and others had this illusion. Somehow we, Arab and Jewish worker, will create here a socialist kingdom, if you will, or some utopia to be the stage for the proletariat to take over the world, that sort of thing. He changed his position with the Arab revolt. And there were others like him, people of Brit Shalom in the 1920s, a binational state. Some of the leading intellectuals of the time.
But wasn't Zionism an exclusively Jewish endeavor?
It was, but I'm saying is, what's the old cliche? 2 Jews, 3 opinions.
Right.
There was no monolithic Jewish position, certainly until the 1930s, and even then, people like Magnus and others held on, as did Hashem Artzeh, to binationalism. The vast majority, however, in the Yishuv, realized this was a fight to the finish. It was an irreconcilable rift. Once both peoples, Arab and Jew, said, we want sovereignty. The Jews were prepared to compromise, hence the partition, but the Arabs were not. And ultimately, the British decided, with an impending war against Hitler, we've got to appease the majority, not only because they're in Palestine, but because of the Muslims in India, the Muslims and the Arabs all around the region, oil, etc. So appeasement, hence the white paper of May 39.
Going back to the Arab Palestinians, how influential was the rise then in the early stages of Arab nationalism in the Middle East?
The Arab nationalism is very strong in the early 30s, not earlier, because Egypt and Syria were gradually, and Iraq, moving to independence. The British understood this, and they were coming to all sorts of treaties. And therefore, this obviously spurs a lot of Palestinian nationalism. There are other factors as well. Mussolini, trying to get a foothold in the Mediterranean, is sending funds to the Palestinian Arabs, as are the Nazis, who also want a foothold in the area. And therefore, I think all these factors, we have to look at the world picture, influence the Palestinian nationalists in the 1930s. It doesn't happen earlier.
But not so much the other Arab nations. They were looking across the Jordan, up north or down south, and saw Arab nationalism in the making and said, we want to be just like our brethren.
That's true. In other words, I indicated that some already had growing independence appreciated by the British. And the Palestinian nationalists are influenced by this.
And the British didn't react in the same way to the Palestinian nationalists?
No, because the Mediterranean, if you know your geography, Palestine is exactly on the center of a line from London all the way to India. They need that Suez Canal centered in the British world, and therefore they're not prepared to give up on Palestine. After World War II, different events saw the breakup of the British Empire.
Before 1933, were there any Palestinian leaders who considered the possibility of integrating some of the Jews into their idea of sovereignty? I mean, was there a diversity of opinions just like there was within the Zionist leadership?
I get the strong impression, although that's not the subject of this book, that before 1933, any Palestinian leadership strongly did not appreciate the coming of Jews into Palestine, etc. But, as I said again, there was the Mufti and others with the riots that really were triggered by religious motions. They're taking over Al-Aqsa, which never happened, but this was propaganda.
A good rallying cry.
A good rallying cry, as we see today as well. So therefore, I didn't see any diversity willing to accept this. And even in the 1930s, when Magnus and others met with some Arab leaders quietly, there was no strong sense yes, we'll give Jews a place in the sun and majority, etc. I didn't see that ever.
Do you see this period as really the origin of the intractability of the conflict?
I do, because sovereignty means I want my independence. And if I see another group coming in and challenging it, I'll stand firm. I don't see that beforehand. I see illusions prior to 33, which dissipate after the revolt of 1936.
I mean, again, this is not the subject of your book, but do you see any kind, if you take a bird's eye view on the history of the conflict up until today, do you see any major turning points in the way both sides perceive that? Or, I mean, are we still on the same track?
Well, historians avoid prophecy and avoid really looking long range, but I'm rather bleak in my view of the current situation. Whenever asked, I say, I hope for peace. I have no illusion for real shalom. I'd like sheket. I'd like quiet.
Right, okay.
And unfortunately, we don't see this today.
This book is part of a trilogy.
Correct.
Tell us a bit about it, and how does it feed into your following research?
Interesting. Years ago, in the 1970s, I began to study this whole question. I was sidetracked because of the interest, thanks to Gerald Green's TV miniseries, Holocaust, etc., to write extensively about how the Allies responded during the Holocaust years. That was my classic, The Jews Were Expendable. I wrote other things, but I came back to this just before I made Aliyah, which is 13 plus years ago, from Touro College in Brooklyn and other places. I basically published the second volume of the trilogy. It was called Decision on Palestine Deferred, America, Britain, and Wartime Diplomacy, 1939-1945. Why start in the middle, in medias res, so to speak? Because at Columbia, where I took my doctorate, I got to know Roosevelt well, because my first book had nothing to do with this, the Federal Writers Project, WPA, 1930s, Works Progress Administration. So I focused on the war years. And that was published by Frank Cass in London in May of 2002. And this one took a long time in coming, because once making Aliyah, I continued with extensive research all over the world, but focused obviously here in Eretz Israel on the prelude, so to speak, 33 to 39. And now I'm finishing research on the period from 1945 to 1948, the end of World War II, to the rise of the state.
And how different are they from each other?
Oh, well, the war years is an interesting story, because it directly relates to the Holocaust years. And that's obviously the most tragic of the whole period that I'm studying. 1933 to 39 is seeing how this slowly develops. As I said, this rift between the two sides, that's really inevitable. And I'm not the only one to say this. The Peel Commission understood that this was an irreconcilable rift unless something could be done.
As early as 1937.
37, correct, 37, 38. They understood this. The Holocaust years a different story, because there, and that's the most tragic part of it, there you see the British and American governments basically deciding to defer a decision, push it on the side. What that meant was closing the doors of the most obvious haven for Jews in Europe, i.e. Palestine, the blessed covenanted home. That basically meant the death of thousands and thousands of Jews who could have come.
It's not just Palestine. They would have gone anywhere.
True, but the point is, vis-a-vis the map of Europe, when other havens are closed, had Palestine been opened, it would have been far different. As an example, let's go to 38 rather, Golda Meir, then Goldie Meyerson, representing the Histadrut Labor Organization, goes to the Evian Conference on Refugees. The last effort, July 38, the bucolic area of Evian-les-Bains in France, to see what can we do with these refugees. Notice the Jewish identity is masked. They're refugees, not Jews.
Right.
So you can push it aside.
And they're talking only about German Jews, right?
No, German and Austrian You know,
Right.
because already Hitler came into Austria, the Anschluss in March 38.
But not all the Jews of the East.
That's correct. But to see, because they knew that if Hitler expanded it, he says openly in Mein Kampf, it's an open secret, it's all there, page 1 and on, that more Jews would need refuge. Golda Meir at Evian, when they decided to do nothing, Golda Meir says, this is the best reason why we must have our own state. So you have an open door to all Jews who needed this. But as I said, how different? Obviously, the 30s is different from World War II and the terrible, terrible catastrophe, nothing like it in Jewish or world history, i.e. the Holocaust. And 45 to 48 is something different. Why? Because I see it also, if you look at the span of Jewish history, there are ups and downs. Rupture, revival. Rupture is the Holocaust. It's a chasm, that's really unbridgeable to this day. You can't fill it. It's gone. 1.5 million Jewish children, just think of that, just killed. And everybody else who was killed. Now, 45, 48, revival, regeneration. What's remarkable there, and not enough attention is paid to this, in all the histories, various factors led to the rise of the State of Israel. We won't delineate them now. That's not our subject. But one that's not paid enough attention to is the survivors themselves. 2/3 of the survivors said straight away to the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry, 1946, to UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, 47, Palestine. That's our first choice. Here's a great vignette that I discovered. Eleanor Roosevelt, the number one woman of the world, is sent by Truman to the DP, so-called displaced persons. Notice again, Jewish identity masked behind displaced persons. Displaced? Anybody going to go back to the blood-soaked soil of Europe? Of course not. Of course they would have wanted to go elsewhere. Palestine was their first choice. And they go on these rickety boats, over 70,000 of them, most of them diverted to Cyprus from August 46 by the British. The Exodus affair is known, etc., etc. This persuades the world, in large measure, non-Jews, I'm saying, to embrace Zionism, because after Auschwitz-Birkenau, you need a haven.
But not the British Empire,
correct,
nor the Palestinian Arabs.
That's correct. Haj Amin al-Husseini is still, together with others, fulminating for revolt, etc., etc. The tragedy was that the Palestinian Arabs had a chance to create a state in the 30s with the partition offer. They rejected that. They even rejected officially the White Paper of 39, which really was the last nail in the coffin of the Balfour Declaration, because the British said from May 39 to the next 5 years, a maximum of 75,000 Jews are to be admitted into Palestine, and here are the crucial words, 4 words. Thereafter, with Arab consent. No Arab, freely given a choice, would want any Jew coming into Palestine. So the British Empire as well, because they wanted to hold on to that, and they were forced out for many reasons. But the fact remains that the Jews, already in the 30s, had created the infrastructure which the Palestinian Arabs, alas, did not. And therefore, when it came to 45 to 48, they were leaderless. They had no infrastructure. They couldn't stand up against a strongly united Yishuv, particularly after the Holocaust. One last point on this. To show the impact of the Holocaust, not just the survivors coming. When the British, despite the Holocaust, in October of 1945, announced via the Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin that we are going to basically continue the White Paper, giving 1,500 legal certificates a month. Just think of that number, 1,500 a month. That same month, or a month later, the 3 hitherto divided Jewish underground movements in Eretz Yisrael united. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern Group. And they were there together for almost a year. So the Holocaust plays a vital role in all this. It's not crucial. The Jewish state would have created beforehand, had it happened in the 30s, because the infrastructure and all was there.
And the rest, as they say, is history. But I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. Professor Monty Noam Penkower, you're a Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at Machon here in Jerusalem, and the author of the recently published Palestine in Turmoil, The Struggle for Sovereignty, 1933 to 1939. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
לא רוצה להיות לבד עכשיו, אני קורא לך ואת לא עונה, את עזבת הלכת מכאן, כי בלעדייך כל העיר הזאת ריקה, והרחובות ביתומים, ברגע של געגועים, ברגע של דממה, אקרא לך שובי אל העיר הזאת, עכשיו אליי. שבפנים עצוב וקר והלילה שוב נגמר בלעדייך ואני מרגיש עצוב רחוק ומנותק כמה עצב יש באהבה אני לבד פתאום בבית זר ואני אוהב אותך כי בלעדייך כל העיר הזאת ריקה והרחובות ביתומים ברגע של געגועים, ברגע של דממה, אקרא לך שובי אל העיר הזאת, עכשיו אליי. כשהלכת אמרתי בואי, רציתי שתישארי כאן לידי, לאהוב תמיד, לאהוב אותך תמיד. עכשיו אליי